Well, tonight we are beginning doing our introductory lesson to the study on the minor prophets. The study we're doing is a study on the prophets of Jonah, Amos, and Hosea, and we're not going to be looking into those books tonight. I want to do an introduction of the lesson we're going to be doing, the series we'll be doing, but also to give an overview of the basically the history of northern Israel, because the prophets we'll be looking at are all prophets to northern Israel. And I want to talk about that because if you were like, well, me for many years, or most Christians, the kingdom after David, really, or after the idea of Solomon, is a pretty is a blur. Stefan, there's some water bottles in the back. I think someone could use one. So, they're in the office there by the printer. The history of Israel, you come out of Egypt, you kind of understand, you get into the promised land, you understand, but then after David and really Solomon's time, when it gets to the two, Rehoboam and Jeroboam, it gets confusing right there because they sound the same, and then it's all a little bit hard to track as you're going through the Kings and Chronicles, because you talk about the kings of Judah for a bit, then it'll go right into Israel, it'll backtrack, so it's a little confusing. So today I want to try to do an overview of some of that history to at least help you to have a grasp on some of those things as we begin our study in this series. But before we get into the kind of the background of northern Israel, we'll talk about the study that we're doing. I sent an email out, or Nancy did a couple weeks ago, that had the book that we'll be going through. It's a Bible study written by, I think it's John MacArthur, his ministry, through Jonah, Hosea, and Amos. And the plan that we're going to be doing is this. So this week is the introduction, which there's also an introduction chapter in your book. If you bought one, you can totally buy one and do the homework along with us. We encourage you to do that. I think you'll get more out of the studies if we do that. But what the plan is that, so next week we'll do lesson 1, which is going to cover the first 2 chapters of Jonah. And so in anticipation of next week's lesson, you can do chapter 1 or the lesson 1, the homework, which covers a bunch of questions and history and goes through a bunch of information in those 2 chapters of Jonah. And the goal is, if you decide to do the homework, that'd be great. You can come to the Bible study and we'll have discussion relating to some of the reading, but also to a lesson I'll be doing. So what I'll be doing next week, for instance, for Jonah 1 and 2, is have a lesson related to those 2 chapters. There won't be an identical regurgitation of what you just read if you did your homework. So you'll be able to get something new out of Wednesday night. But also, if you don't do the Bible study at home, you won't be in the dark either. So I'm trying to do best of both worlds and encourage with opportunities to study and to grow and to make time in your life, in your schedule, to do some intentional study in God's Word. So basically, each week I'll kind of preview or give you what the next lesson's going to be, and you can work on that. And if you have the books, you'll be able to go through that pretty straightforwardly. I charted it out based upon Christmas and Thanksgiving and all the different things that can kind of interrupt the regular schedule. This series will take us through the end of February, March, beginning of March of 2026. So we'll be in these 3 prophets for that amount of time. I don't know why my voice is cracking here. So with that, what I'd like to do is begin an introduction and just an overview of the divided kingdom, because we talk about the prophets, the time of the prophets, whether it's Isaiah and Jeremiah, the major prophets or the minor prophets. It's during the time of the divided kingdom, post Solomon. There were prophets during the times of Saul and David and Solomon, but they weren't the writing prophets. Samuel obviously is a prophet, and so was Gad and others, Nathan as well, during David's time. But the writing prophets came afterwards. And so basically, well, let me just see if I can do this here. So this just kind of gives a quick overview of the beginning of the two kingdoms. On the top line is the kingdom of Israel, northern Israel, and the bottom line is the kingdom of Judah, the southern kingdom. And the way to remember this, obviously, is the top one is north, bottom is south, and David's line is a southern kingdom. And if I went through all of the all the chart that I have, the top line ends, and I'll turn this off and come back to it in a minute. But the top line ends right there during the reign of Hezekiah, which, as you're reading through Isaiah's book or whatever in Second Chronicles and Second Kings, you see the Assyrian invasion destroying northern Israel and then coming down into Judah, that's when it happens in 3 books. All the Assyrians woke up and everybody around them was dead, because 185,000 Assyrian warriors were dead overnight when God delivered Hezekiah and Judah from their military campaign. But this just kind of gives you an idea of just kind of the layout for the two kingdoms. And we'll come back to this visual aid in just a second. But what happened was, obviously, the kingdom was combined. We're familiar with that under Saul, and then under David, and then under Solomon. But then after Solomon, it divided. So the question is, what precipitated the divided kingdom? And most of us are probably more familiar with this part of the story than of the rest. If I was to ask you, and I think I actually have this, I can show that later. If I was to ask you, was King David a good king or a bad king, we would answer properly he was a good king. If I was to ask you if Solomon was a good king or a bad king, what would we say? He was a good king, bad king? What would we say? It depends. And that's exactly right. And I think I have a chart that I was looking through my childhood Bible. It was the Adventure Study Bible. It was a NIV for kids back when I got it when I was baptized. And in the one of the charts I remember from that book was it had the kings of the combined kingdom. Then it had the kings of Judah and the kings of Israel. And I noticed that there's some good kings in Judah's line, but if you looked through Israel's line, it was all bad except for 2 that were mostly bad. Everyone was really bad or just mostly bad. Everyone was terrible on that side of the divide. So, but as we're thinking about Solomon, it's proper to think about him. Yes, he was wise. Yes, he was wealthy. Yes, God used him and blessed him, and he had a reign of peace. He was going to live in peace, which meant inner turmoil in the nation, not external threats necessarily. But we need to remember that when God blessed him significantly, but Solomon actually began the rebellions against God, or leaned into them and created them, that ended up dividing the kingdom. So Solomon's reign, he begins really well. David sets him up for success. When David is about ready to die, or he's nearing the end of his life, he begins to gather materials for the construction of the temple. David can't build it, but he gathers the wood. He gets all the stuff figured out with the Sidonians, and he gathers iron, he gathers gold and silver, and all the materials that Solomon will need to build the temple. And then when he dies, Solomon begins that process. Solomon's reign begins really well. He consolidates power at the very beginning of his reign, because really at the end of David's life, right before Solomon became king, Adonijah, his brother, was going to try to take over the kingdom. It was Adonijah and Joab and Abiathar, the priest. So Joab was David's general. Abiathar was the high priest. They were all kind of going to be with Adonijah to make him king, because he was the older one. And then there was this kind of a reverse coup by Nathan and by Bathsheba and by David and by Solomon to anoint Solomon and make him king and sit him on the throne while David was still alive. And once Solomon was king, he was initially merciful to his brother Adonijah, but then after Adonijah wanted to essentially marry the woman who should be queen, she was David's kind of nursemaid at the end. Solomon said, well, you spoke that against your own life, and now, Benaiah, go ahead and execute my brother for his rebellion. And then Joab ran into the tabernacle, held onto the horns of the tabernacle. He was executed. Abiathar was banished because of his rebellion. He established his reign solidly and began to follow the Lord and honor the Lord in his reign. God appeared to him twice during his lifetime. In 1 Kings chapter 3, God appeared to him at Gibeon. This is before the temple was built, and God offered him, really, ask what you desire. And whether it be long life, riches, the death of your enemies, and Solomon asked for wisdom to judge his people well, which is, again, the right thing to ask for. I always tell particularly teens or whenever we're going through James chapter 1 says, if you lack wisdom, ask for it. God will give you wisdom. That's a great thing to ask for. You always need it, and you will be given it by the Lord. So Solomon was granted wisdom, and this is one of the things he's known by. As a matter of fact, when the Queen of Sheba comes to visit, she recognizes his amazing wisdom to judge and lead his people. One of the more famous stories of Solomon's wisdom is the two harlots who both have children within a couple days of each other in one home, and one of the children dies overnight, and the mom of the dead child steals the living child. And they both come before David and say, well, the living child is mine, the dead child is hers. Solomon hears he has no idea. There's no genetic testing. I mean, and newborn babies look very similar to one another, particularly very early on. So he calls for a sword, and he says, let's divide the baby in half and give half to each woman. One woman says, she can have the baby. Let him live. She can have the baby. The other woman says, yes, divide him. We'll each have half. And Solomon rightly says, the mom is most concerned about the life of the baby. It's his. She's his, or her. He's hers. Excuse me. Pronouns there. And his wisdom was established as being pretty amazing. And he did a great job at the beginning. He built the temple and his house, his royal residence. I believe the temple took about 7 years to build. Let's see here. Yeah, 7 years to build, and I believe his home took about 10 years to build, and it was a massive undertaking. And really for the first probably, again, 15, 20 years of his life as king, he was making great steps. In the end of the temple construction, there's this amazing celebration where many animals are sacrificed, and even the glory of God comes in the temple. So even the priests can't stay inside of the temple; they have to come out because God's presence is overwhelming. It is amazing, and God then again visits or appears to Solomon and gives him a vision and promises to Solomon that if he continues in faith and obedience to God, that his children will, again, continue in the line and on the throne of David. But as we know, Solomon is also famous for one other thing. He had 1,000 wives, or 900 plus concubines. And in the book of Ecclesiastes, the author, who we believe is Solomon, it says he multiplied for himself all the great things that he could to enjoy, whether it's gardens and all kinds of things, concubines. He did everything he could to indulge in pleasure, which he found ultimately at the end of his life to be hollow and meaningless. But one of the great tragedies of that was that his wives drew his heart away from following the Lord. As a matter of fact, one of the things that God had commanded, particularly in the law as well as in the prophets to the kings were not to take wives of foreign wives, because if they did, those women would still have be beholden to their foreign gods and draw the hearts of their husbands, the kings, away from the Lord God. And that's exactly what happened. As a matter of fact, there's really three main things that kings were not supposed to do, and one they were supposed to do. More than that, but they were supposed to write a copy of the law themselves under the oversight of the priests so they could study it and know it and learn it. There's no indication that Solomon did that necessarily, but he was not to multiply wives, multiply silver and gold, or go back to Egypt to get horses. He did all of those three things. You can find that list in 1 Kings 10, 26 to 28 is where those things are found. And ultimately, his heart didn't just get pulled away and allow his wives to worship false gods. After he built the temple in Jerusalem, he began to build high places and worship centers for Ashtoreth, Molech, Milcom, Chemosh, all kinds of foreign terrible gods. These are the ones, you know, that God is against in the conquest of Canaan. But also it is the plague in the kingdoms of the child sacrificing gods of Chemosh or Chemosh and Milcom. These are all despicable and horrible idols, gross, detestable idols. And Solomon also built their holy places. He also, in 1 Kings chapter 11, it says in verse 4 that he participated in those worship services for those gods. So Solomon began really in the middle of his reign and he's not alone. Some of his grandchildren, great-grandchildren did the same thing. They started out well and they kind of got pulled away. There's some tragic stories of that throughout the kingdom of Judah. But ultimately, this infidelity on Solomon's part, infidelity to God, brought God to bring about the difficulties. Later on in the life of Solomon's reign, God brought up adversaries from Edom, from other places, but also internal struggles and trials, particularly with a man named Jeroboam. Jeroboam, according to 1 Kings chapter 11, was an official. He was over some of the forced labor. He was some kind of a civil servant in charge of some significant tasks for the work projects of the kingdom. The prophet Ahijah comes to visit Jeroboam, and his cloak is torn into pieces, into 12 pieces, and he tells Jeroboam, take 10 pieces. Jeroboam picks up 10 pieces, and he says, God's giving you 10 tribes. You'll be king of 10 tribes, and I'm keeping one back for Solomon. For David's sake, he'll keep one tribe. That would be the tribe of Benjamin along with Judah. Well, this didn't sit well with Solomon, king of Israel, so Jeroboam fled while Solomon lived. And after Solomon died, Rehoboam became king, his son. And the famous, you may remember this from Rehoboam, the only thing you might remember about Rehoboam is when he became king, the nation came and said, hey, Solomon worked us hard, we would like a break. And the elders, who were Solomon's counselors, said to Rehoboam, do this, be gentle, be compassionate with the people, and they will love you. Rehoboam's friends, again, his peers said, these people don't know how bad it can be. You tell them that you're stronger than your father. Your whip's like a scorpion compared to his. And he's like, yeah, I like the sound of that, having all that power. So he did that. And the people rebelled against him and actually killed some of his servants. And they took Jeroboam as king. Now, one thing that God had said through the prophet Ahijah to Jeroboam, he said this. This is an amazing story, or amazing promise, that in 1 Kings 11, he promised that if Jeroboam remained faithful to God over the 10 northern tribes, that he would have an abiding dynasty in the north, like David's dynasty in the south. That if Jeroboam would be faithful and follow the Lord, he would have an enduring line, an everlasting line. So Jeroboam was set up for success. He was called by a prophet. You can almost see the similarities between David and Saul. When you have Solomon and Jeroboam, you see some of those similarities there. Well, Jeroboam becomes king, and I'm going to pull up a map here. Let's see if I have. There we go. This is a map of the kingdom, of the divided kingdom, and you can kind of see the blue part of the bottom there. That's Judah, and the kind of the orange at the top. That's Israel. That's the northern kingdom of Israel. So when we talk about Israel, northern Israel, we call it that because it's the north. Well, he had a problem because if you look at this next picture here, Jerusalem is the very northern end of Judah, and that's where the temple is, okay? And Jeroboam, he had a problem, a political social problem. He thought if everybody goes 3 times a year to Jerusalem to worship, their hearts are going to be pulled back to be with the kings in Judah, and I'll lose my place. So what he decided to do was he said, we're going to worship God, but we're going to worship him maybe according to some other kinds of historical practices, going back to maybe even what the people did in the wilderness with Aaron and the golden calf. But he set up 2 different places of worship. Now, if you can see at the very top of the screen, you see the town named Dan. That's at the very top of, near the very northern edge of the nation of Israel. He put a shrine up there with a golden calf. And if you look down at the bottom, just kind of, you go to Jerusalem and go up a little bit, you see Bethel over to the left there. That is another holy site where he put another place of worship. So he said, I'm going to catch the pilgrims going south, and I'm going to put a place in the north so that it's going to be easier for the people of Israel to go and worship the one true God. And he set up golden calves, and he also set up his own priesthood and other feast days. So what he did is he made his own version, his man-made version of a worship of God, which included idolatry, which included non-Aaronic priests, and included his own created festivals, and he also participated in the sacrifices and offerings. The king was also essentially a religious officer, which we see some various interactions there. But this is what was known as the sin of Jeroboam. This setting up, establishment of this cult, of this false religion. And it was the worship of the one true God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but it was done in a wrong way, with the wrong priesthood, with the wrong forms, the wrong customs, but they called it the worship of God. And this was what was known as the sin of Jeroboam. So if you were to ask regular, people in the region who worships, if they had to use the name Yahweh, who worships Yahweh, they'd say, well, Judah and Israel do. They both worship Yahweh. They have different forms, but they worship Yahweh. Well, the difference was, at least by virtue of the temple and the ordinances and the priesthood, one was true, the other was not. Now we come to see in the Kings and Chronicles that both are corrupted in different ways. The religion in the south is corrupted differently, but it's also corrupted. But the idea is that the sin of Jeroboam is that he created this false cultic worship. And again, because his fear was that as soon as people go to Jerusalem, pretty often they're going to want to be back to Judah and I'll die. And what happened actually when he created this set of religious ordinances and this religious worship, all the Levites from the north just flooded, not all, most flooded down into Judah. Because they're like, we have no place here anymore. They've cut out our inheritance. Remember, the Lord and his service was the inheritance of the Levites. And Jeroboam just eradicated one of those tribes in that regard. Plus, most of all the faithful believers in the true God who saw this for what it was, they also, from all the other tribes, went down into the southern kingdom. So Judah was bolstered by this activity. And but you can think about the hollowing out of the faithful remnant in Israel if they all fled properly. Now we do find in the prophets, there's this group called the Sons of the Prophets that appear with Elijah or Elisha in the times of this divided kingdom. And they're always, I'm pretty positive, they're always located in the northern kingdom. That would be the faithful, believing remnant in the north who worshiped God according to the dictates and the ordinances of God, whether they went to the temple or they followed the true prophets who were leading where the priests might have failed. But this is a sin of Jeroboam, and every single king that followed after Jeroboam, whether they were in his line or not, and if we look at this list here, only the first two, Jeroboam the first and Nadab, that's only his house. His house ends very shortly after his death. So, and if you want to, and pretty much all of these, most of these, Baasha was by himself, Elah was by himself. There was no other examples of a dynastic consistency inside of the northern kingdom. You had Omri to Ahab. That was because Omri took over and Ahab was his son. That was a two generations of rulers. But really, until Jehu, well, I suppose I take that back, because Jehu annihilates the house of Ahab, and so there's his grandson reigns for a little bit of time. But there's upheaval and chaos in the northern kingdom because Jeroboam began in this way of opposing God, and the further kings continued in that. And as a matter of fact, as you go past Jehu, now Jehu had 4 kings who were his successors, and it's important because as you look at this chart here, you see that Jeroboam II right there, that's the last king of the line of Jehu. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more in a minute here. But that's important because if you look down below that, you'll see Jonah, Amos, and Hosea, kind of those little blue and red or blue and yellow flags kind of beside them. That shows you kind of where their ministries intersected and kind of went together in those times. So they were during the reign of Jeroboam II, and then through potentially up to with Hosea, up until the final king of the north before he was ultimately destroyed by Assyria. But Jeroboam II was the final king in the most stabilized dynasty in the north, because again, if we look at Baasha was a king. He was a general in the army. He destroyed all of Jeroboam's children. Then after he dies, there's this quick turnover and then some civil war infighting until Omri becomes king and really establishes his rule. Ahab and then his children kind of last for a little bit of time until Jehu comes along. And I think actually the timing is actually, I think, actually shorter for Ahab's grandson there. But Jehu then comes, and it's famous where he comes and he kills the king of Israel and the king of Judah, who's visiting at the same time, and destroys them. And then he sends a letter to the king, the people, the high men of Samaria, and he says, "You have a son of Ahab, set him on the throne and fight for him." And they say, "We saw what you did to the kings, we'll follow you." And he said, "Okay, you cut off all the heads of Ahab's kids and then pile them outside the city." And so they did. And so Jehu says, "Hey, I killed the king. You guys killed all these people. Now follow me." Basically, is what happened. And the thing about Jehu that I like, he's one of the mostly bad kings of northern Israel, because he did a thing that I always, whenever I'm reading through the Kings and Chronicles, I'm always like, man, could Jehu have really been a true believer? I don't probably not, because he does this thing where he wipes out Baal worship in the north when he comes to power. Because what happened is Omri and he had his son Ahab marry Jezebel. Jezebel was the daughter of a guy named Ethbaal from another king, which Ethbaal means you think about the worship of Baal. So Ahab introduced Baal worship into the northern kingdom. And what Jehu the king does after he wipes out Ahab's line is he says, "Priests of Baal, call a great feast and worship celebration for all the worshippers of Baal in the kingdom." And they, "Yes, let's do that. Give them holy garments. Do all." And so Jehu's like underwriting this great Baal festival. He tells his guards, he says, "Okay, it's begun." And he says, "If any of them gets out of there alive, you're dead. So go in there and kill all the Baal worshipers, including the priests." And they wiped out Baal worship in that one fell swoop in the north. But Jehu started out pretty good in that regard, but he did not divert from Jeroboam's wicked worship of God in those two places, Dan and Bethel. So God promised, he says, "Well, Jehu, you'll have sons for 4 generations on the throne, but after that, that's it." And Jeroboam II is the final king of the north under the line of Jehu. And after that, it is a quick succession of like 50 years or whatever of like conspiracies, assassinations. There's no stability in the nation at the time when Assyria is again gaining ascendancy in their power to the north. So Jeroboam the second's reign is when we have really Jonah's time, and we'll talk about Jonah and Assyria particularly next time. But Jeroboam's time was a time of peace and prosperity. He'd gained back land that had been lost to other nations. Again, he's the fourth generation ruler of stable kingship in the north. And so there was prosperity, there was general peace and security, but there was this underlying bed of religious apostasy, rebellion, and what you read in the prophets is social strife. There's a lot of oppression of the poor, a lot of all kinds of bad things going on. But that's the time when Jonah, Amos, and Hosea are really coming on the scene at the end of the sunsetting period of the height of the northern kingdom's prosperity and security, at least going back to the times of maybe Ahab or maybe back to Jeroboam the first. And so when God sends these prophets into, well, Jonah goes to Nineveh, he doesn't go to the northern kingdom, but when he sends Amos and Hosea to Israel, he says to them, they're not going to listen to you. They don't want to hear any of what you're saying because they don't believe they're going to be able to fall or whatever else it might be. But they're coming to a people who are strong and proud and haughty. And they're being told that, the Lord is telling them through the prophets that they're going to fall and be judged unless they repent. And the sad story is, as you see, the end of that line is they don't, and Assyria is carried off. And it starts off, the downfall of the northern kingdom of Israel started like almost the very beginning of that yellow line when Jeroboam said, we're going to set up a place of worship in the north and in the south. And that was the besetting sin that never was taken away. And that was why the kingdom of the north fell. And for symmetry, I don't have it labeled there, but the next, if we ever do it sometime after Hezekiah on the bottom, that next group there, the next little, what's that game called? Tetris. The next Tetris piece in the bottom there is Manasseh. King Manasseh reigned almost the longest in the south. His story, we should do a study on Manasseh. I love the story of Manasseh. He is a terrible, terrible king. But I love it because his story is a story of redemption. He, during his life as king of Judah, again, it's following the destruction of Assyria and following God's preservation of Judah from Assyria. He begins child sacrifice worship in Judah and even brings a lot of garbage into the temple. And I've called him somewhat kind of jokingly, he's the witch king of Judah. Thinking about Lord of the Rings, there's the one of the antagonists is called the Witch King of Angmar. He's one of the bad lieutenants of the evil. Anyway, Manasseh is the Witch King of Judah, and actually it's because of his transgressions and his doubling down on the sins of idolatry and wickedness that God says finally that's it. Because of Manasseh, we're done, and that's Josiah is the next longest king that reigns. God says I'm still going to wipe out Judah. But once Josiah is gone. But it's because of what Manasseh does in similar fashion. He doesn't set up false places of worship, but his perversions of the worship of the true God are so severe that God says, we're done. We're done here. And that's really kind of the symmetry there. But when it comes to the prophets, we're talking about the northern kingdom. So if we remember the besetting sin of the north was their religious apostasy when they made a false version of the true worship of God. If that makes sense. A false worship of the true God, which God found absolutely abhorrent. And it was for that ultimate reason why they were judged, because they continued in that and all the things that followed from that. And you can see as you read through the Kings and Chronicles, you can see that there are encounters with the prophets of the Lord of the north, which is if you read the story of, it's actually the time of Ahab, Ahab wants to go and attack Ramoth Gilead, and he says, should we do this? And the king from Judah is actually a good king. They say, let's hear what the Lord says. And Ahab brings out his prophets of the Lord, and they say, go, you'll gore them like an ox gores its prey. And the king from Judah says, can we actually get a word from the Lord here? Because these guys aren't the true true spokesman. And Ahab famously says, there's one guy, but I hate him. He never says anything good about me. His name is Micaiah. And Micaiah comes out and he says, and they say, what you going to say? And Micaiah, you can follow this along, but this is how I always read. He says, Micaiah comes out and says, yes, go, conquer, you'll be great. You go ahead and do it. And the king says, well, have I not told you to only preach, say the truth in the name of the Lord? And Micaiah says, I saw all Israel scattered as sheep without a shepherd. And he goes on to say that, Ahab will fall. So Ahab says, put him in prison, feed him with bread and water until I come back. And Micaiah, his final words are, if you ever come back, then God's not spoken to me. Everybody listen to what I just said, is what he says. And we know that Ahab dies on his way back from the battle. But there was this, again, mix and mingling of worshipers of God that said they're worshiping the true God, but were false religionists throughout the north. And again, that was the besetting sin of the northern kingdom. A lot of amazing, vibrant history and details there. But again, the takeaway, the primary takeaway for our purposes in our study is the time of the prophets that we're going to look at in these next several weeks is a time of stability and relative peace in a decadent, idolatrous, broken society. So, couple questions here. Has there been any of the stuff we talked about tonight? Any of these details, whether you read the introduction or not for the series, that maybe that you think is going to help you in preparing for study for the Minor Prophets? I hope it has. Again, some of these things. Again, question 2 that I want to talk about for a second is, again, for review, because it's important. What was the sin of Jeroboam? When the Bible says that the kings of the north followed the sins of Jeroboam, what was the sin of Jeroboam? Anybody remind us what that was? Isaiah, what was the sin of Jeroboam? Yeah. He set up false worship of the true God after the fashion of the nations, but also after the fashion of Aaron and the golden calf. Yep, good. Why do you think, this is not written on your outlines, why is that important for us to remember the sin of Jeroboam? And why would that be an important thing for us to remember today? Braden, why would it be important to remember that? Okay. Anybody else? Why would it be important to remember that Jeroboam's sin was a perversion of the worship of the true God in the ways that he did it? Why would that be an important thing for us to remember? Yeah, oftentimes temptation has a ring of truth, a ring of something, but it's off enough. Okay, good. Anybody else? What's the difference between a denomination and a religion? Christian denomination and a Christian religion. Any ideas? You might say, wait, what do you mean? Well, here's what I mean. Denomination is language we use today, I believe, to refer to sects of religion, of Christian followers and traditions that are underneath the broad umbrella of biblical Christianity. So, for instance, Lutheranism, Presbyterianism, Methodism, at least historically, Baptists, Bible churches, Ephraim, they'd be different denominations underneath the broad umbrella of biblical Christianity that I would say falls under the true worship of the true God and does so with a true understanding of salvation. Now, a false or a false Christian religion would be a religion that gets the identity of God right, but worships him or tries to come to him in a way that is abominable, idolatrous, is in a way that is not pleasing to the Lord. For instance, think of Jeroboam. They have the name right. They have some of the details about he's the one who delivered out of Egypt right, but they worship in ways that are abominable. You could use things like the Mormon religion would be a non-Christian religion with the name of Christian in it. I would put Roman Catholicism in that same category. You might say, whoa, that sounds a bit harsh. This happened to come across my feed today. There's this great, really good YouTube channel ministry called WWUTT, When We Understand the Text, by a pastor from the South. He does usually a pretty good couple of minutes on various Christian issues. This one, I had not seen this quote from a popular Roman Catholic priest, who basically said this, essentially, when it comes to their doctrine of communion, the Eucharist. Because Roman Catholics believe that when they take the bread and the cup, that it becomes the actual body and blood of Jesus. He is present, body, soul, and divinity with the elements. So much so that according to the Roman Catholic Catechism, that it is that because, I'll quote here from 1418 of the Catholic Catechism, because Christ himself is present in the sacrament of the altar, which is the Eucharist, he is to be honored with worship of adoration. In other words, you're to worship the blood, the bread, and the wine. So when in the sacrifice of the Mass, when there's genuflecting, when there's bowing, they're bowing towards the cup or the bread, because Christ is present there, body, soul, and divinity. Now they would say, and Roman Catholics do say, well, it's not that the elements themselves, the actual, they say I forget the word they use, but basically we're not looking at the actual thing itself, but it's who is there in and with it and through it. But that's what idolatry always was. I mean, Jews didn't think that, or the Northern Kingdom didn't think that God himself was a golden calf. He was represented by the calf. But anyway, this Roman Catholic priest, he said, because the story was that he was leading a Catholic camp at a Protestant campground, and some of the trustees of the campground said, "We don't know if we like this because that's the stuff they do with the Mass is a problem because they worship the host, they worship the Eucharist." And the priest says, "You're right, we do that." And he says, if the Eucharist if it's not really Jesus, the priest said this, he says, we're the biggest idolaters in the history of the world, which was an amazingly true statement. Now, he doesn't believe that he's an idolater, but it's the truth. So I think the sin of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, is very important in recognizing that close enough but no cigar is a good phrase to think of when you're talking about worship of the true God. Getting some details right, but a lot wrong, particularly about either who he is or how we're to approach him, is a terrible, terrible thing. So I find that to be an appropriate thing to understand the problems in northern Israel. I think we understand them rightly. We see those kinds of similar problems in modern day Christendom. It doesn't look the same exact ways that we see them in the northern kingdom of Israel because we're in the 21st century, but the principles are the same. one question, this is kind of question number 4, I guess. What are your thoughts when I remind you of the story of Jeroboam? God promised him, God promised him, to have a line if you just follow. When we reviewed that, and then he, within like days, it almost seems like weeks or months, turned and departed completely from being faithful to God. What did that bring to mind, or what are your thoughts as you heard that story again? You thought about the story of Jeroboam and what he did. Any thoughts? Stephanie.
I mean, how prone to wander we all can be, but I think of Israel as they're coming out and they're just everything that you said we will do, and then they turn around and they're not doing it, and I mean, time and again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anybody else? My foolish first reaction was, man, that guy was foolish. I mean, come on. Why would you do that? How could you be so dumb to do that? And then after a while, I'm like, oh yeah, I probably do. I'm tempted to do the same kinds of things on different scales all the time. It's easy to see the big fails of the Jeroboams or the children of in the wilderness wandering. How could you turn away from God when He brought you out of Egypt and gives you, bread on the ground every morning? How could you just water from a rock? How could you be that foolish? That's true, but at the same time, how prone are we to do the same thing to the promises and the blessings of God in our lives? So I think it's good to see those examples and learn from those examples, but also realize that, he who thinks he stands, take heed lest he fall, in those same kinds of prideful missteps. Well, I hope this jet through history of Northern Israel was helpful and at least a good review. Encourage you to read the introduction, and if you have the book or get the book, get chapter 1 ready for next week. It'll be fun to go through first 2 chapters of Jonah. Let's close in a word of prayer. Lord, thank you so much for this time that we could look into your the history of your word, Lord, and remember the folly of the kings of the north and the nation of the north, Lord, and Lord, as we think about the studies we'll be doing in the Minor Prophets, help us to be sensitive to learn from you, to learn what you have to teach us, and how we can apply even these words to a foreign nation, to an ancient foreign nation that is so separated from us in so many ways, that we can learn and be edified by your word in this study. Lord, bless us tonight as we go, and may we honor you in Christ's name. Amen.